This happened in a small residential area on the outer edge of Nakhon Pathom, which is not far from the main road that connects to Bangkok, Thailand. The location was far enough that the nights felt separated from Bangkok City. The neighborhood was quiet in a practical way. There were houses close to one another, but after 10 at night, most lights were off, and the only sounds came from distant motorbikes or dogs reacting to something no one else noticed. I was renting a single-story wooden house at the time. It was not a traditional in the historical sense, but it was built in an older style with wooden floorboards and simple sliding windows. The front door opened directly to a combined living and dining area. A rectangular wooden table stood near the window, with two chairs facing each other. Behind that space was my bedroom, and to the side was a small kitchen with a gas stove and metal sink. Everything functioned normally. The house did not feel abandoned or neglected. It just simply felt aged. I had been living there for around 3 months when this happened. I was working regular hours at an office in town, and most of my days followed the same structure. I left early in the morning, returned in the evening and cooked something simple and went to sleep. Living alone did not feel unusual to me. I enjoyed the quiet. Growing up, my grandmother had this one rule that she followed constantly without ever making it sound dramatic. She would never leave rice uncovered on the table overnight. If there was leftover rice in a bowl, she covered it with a metal lid. If there was soup, she covered that too. I once asked her why, and she answered in a straightforward tone that some things should not be left out after dark, especially food. She didn't really use frightening language. She didn't really describe spirits in detail. She only said that food is meant for the living and that if you leave it exposed at night, you may be inviting someone else to share it. At the time, I understood it as an old household belief, the kind that comes from a generation that lived closer to ritual than convenience. I followed it when I stayed at her house out of respect, but I never really carried it into my own habits. When I moved into a rental house, I did not really think about it again. That changed slowly, but not in a way that felt dramatic at first. It began on an ordinary weekday without any special event or emotional trigger. There was no argument, no recent funeral, no significant date. It was just simply a normal evening in a normal house, and I was not expecting unusual to happen. The evening it started was not memorable in any meaningful way. It was just a weekday and I had come home later than usual because of extra work. By the time I unlocked the front door, the street outside was already quiet. The neighboring houses were dark and the air felt still in a way that it often does after 10 at night. Inside, everything was exactly as I had left it in the morning. The dining table stood near the window, clean except for a stack of small mails and my keys. The kitchen was quiet, and there was nothing unusual about the space. I changed my clothes, washed my face, and opened the rice cooker from earlier that week. There was still enough rice left for one simple meal. I didn't really feel like cooking anything complicated, so I reheated the rice in a small pot, fried an egg, and ate at the table without turning on the television. It was the kind of quiet dinner that does not require any attention. I remember scrolling through my phone while I ate, not thinking about anything in particular. I didn't really finish the bowl. There was still some rice left at the bottom, and I considered putting it in the refrigerator. Instead, I told myself that I would deal with it in the morning. It was already late and I felt tired enough that the effort seemed unnecessary. I rinsed the pan and left the bowl of rice on the table and turned off the kitchen light. Before going to bed, I walked through the house as I usually did, checking the stove and making sure the front door was locked. The bowl was still there on the dining table, uncovered. I thought to myself that I would clean up the mess and the bowl in the morning when I wake up before going to work. There was nothing unusual about the house at that moment. The floorboards didn't really creak any more than usual, and the air didn't feel different. I fell asleep the way I normally did, with the quiet comfort of knowing I was alone and that everything in the house was at its proper place. At the time, I didn't really connect the uncovered bowl of rice with anything beyond laziness. It was just a small details in an otherwise ordinary night. Sometime during the night, I became aware that I was no longer fully asleep. It was not a sudden awakening. It felt more like my body had surfaced briefly from a deeper sleep without my mind deciding to do so. What brought me to that half-awake state was a sound from the main room. It was soft and brief, not sharp or violent. It sounded like something shifting slightly against the wood. Not falling, not scraping heavily, just a gentle movement as if an object had been notched and then settled again. I didn't really open my eyes at first. I lay still and listened, expecting a second sound that would clarify what I had heard. The house was quiet again. The ceiling fan in my bathroom continued its slow rotation. Outside, a motorbike passed distantly and faded. I told myself it was likely the wooden floor adjusting to the temperature. Old houses often make small noises at night when the air cools. The dining table stood near the window, and it would not have been strange for the frame to shift slightly as the air changed. After a few seconds, the moment felt ordinary again. I didn't really feel alarmed. I did not think of anything beyond the physical structure of the house. I turned slightly onto my side and allowed myself to fall back to sleep. When my alarm rang in the morning, I didn't immediately listen or remember the sound from the night. My routine resumed automatically. I washed my face, I brushed my teeth, and walked towards the main room to make coffee before work. The house looked unchanged. The bowl of rice was still sitting on the dining table exactly where I had left it. The chair across from mine was pushed in neatly. The window was closed, and there was no visible signs of disturbance. Nothing appeared obviously wrong. It was only when I stood close to the window and the table, reaching to move the bowl, that I noticed something slightly unusual about the rice itself. You see, when I looked down into the bowl, I paused for a moment before touching it. The surface of the rice was no longer uneven the way leftover rice usually is after eating. Instead of scattered grains and small ridges from the spoon, the center appeared pressed down in a shallow, rounded shape. It was not deep, it was not messy, it looked contained, almost controlled, as if something had rested gently in the middle and lifted away without dragging. I leaned closer, trying to determine whether I had done it myself without noticing. It was possible that when I stood up the night before, I had placed my hand over the bowl absent-mindedly. I replayed the memory in my mind. I remembered picking up my phone, rinsing the pan, and turning off the light. I did not clearly remember touching the rice. I placed my own palm lightly against the surface to compare the size and angle. The impression matched closely enough to make the explanation feel reasonable. My hand had made that shape, I think. I also considered the humidity. The house did not have air conditioning in the main room, and the nights were often damp. Moisture could have caused the top of the layer of the rice to sink slightly. If condensation that had formed and settled, it might explain the shallow depression. There was no scattered grains around the bowl, no marks on the table, no insects. The chair across from mine remained pushed in. The room itself showed no sign that anyone had entered. I told myself that if something unusual had happened, there would have been clearer evidence. Instead, there was only a slightly altered surface of leftover rice. I threw it away without ceremony, rinsed the bowl, and washed it carefully at the sink. While doing so, I felt a brief hesitation. Not fear exactly, but the sense that I was dismissing something that I had not fully understood. Still, the explanation of humidity and absent-minded movement felt sufficient. All houses respond to temperature, and human memories is imperfect. It was easy to accept that combination as the cause. Before leaving for work, I wiped the dining table with a damp cloth, pushing both chairs neatly into place, and locked the door as usual. By the time I returned home that evening, the incident had already begun to feel less significant, like a small detail exaggerated by lack of sleep. The house looked exactly it had that morning. Nothing unusual happened and nothing appeared disturbed. If the story had ended there, I would not have remembered it at all. Several days passed without anything unusual happening. I continued my routine as before. I cooked simple meals, cleaned up afterward, and made a habit of checking the dining table before going to sleep. I did not consciously tell myself that I was being careful because of the rice incident, but I noticed that I no longer left food uncovered even when I felt tired. One evening, however, I came home later than usual after a meeting with a colleague. I had eaten outside and I still reheated a small portion of rice when I got back, more out of habit than hunger, I would say. I sat at the table for a few minutes, scrolling through messages. When I stood up, there was still a small amount left in the bowl. I remember looking at it and thinking I should put it away. Instead, I rinsed a glass and turned off the kitchen light and went to bed without touching the bowl. It was not a deliberate decision. It felt like a minor lapse in attention. That night, I woke up more clearly than before. The first sound I heard was light and precise. It was not a random shifting noise like the one from the night before. It was more of like a gentle tapping against ceramic, spaced evenly apart. The sound carried faintly through the quiet house, and it was distant enough that I immediately knew it was coming from the dining area. I opened my eyes and lay still listening. The tapping stopped. A few seconds later, I heard the faint scrap of wood against the floor. It was not the sound a chair makes when someone pulls it back carefully, not disruptly but with intention. I didn't really sit up immediately. My mind immediately searched for explanation again. I considered the possibility of a stray cat entering through a gap somewhere, or a rat moving across the table. The tapping, however, had not sounded like claws. It had sounded measured, as if something was testing the edge of the bowl. The house returned to silence. After waiting for several minutes, I decided not to investigate. I convinced myself that getting up in the middle of the night would only make the moment feel longer and larger than it was. If there was an animal, it would leave on its own. If it was simply the house adjusting again, there was nothing to see. In the morning, the first thing I noticed was the position of the chair across from my chair. It was no longer pushed in neatly against the table. It was angled slightly outward, as if someone had been sitting there and then suddenly stood up without pushing it back fully. I approached the table slowly, aware that I was already expecting to see something different. The rice also had changed again. This time, the surface was not pressed in one spot. It was flattened evenly, as if smoothened by a broad hand moving gently back and forth. There were no deep marks, no visible fingerprints, and no grains scattered outside the bowl. It looked deliberate, but controlled. I stood there for a longer time than I had the first morning. The explanation of humidity had no longer fit comfortably. The moisture does not pull out a chair in the living room. An animal does not smooth surfaces evenly. And yet, I still resisted jumping to any conclusion beyond what I could possibly and physically observe. I pushed the chair back in place and threw the rice away. As I rinsed the bowl, I became aware that my reaction was changing. I was no longer simply dismissing the detail. I was watching for it. I was measuring small differences in the room and I would not normally pay attention to. It was the shift. Nothing dramatic had occurred. There was no visible figure, no sudden noise. But the pattern had repeated, and repetition carries weight in a way that single incidence does not. In that day at work, I found myself thinking about the table more than I expected to. Not because I was frightened, but it was because I couldn't construct an explanation that satisfied me completely. When I returned home that evening, I checked the dining area before I even changed clothes. Everything was in place, but I noticed that I was standing in the doorway longer than usual, as if waiting for the house to reveal something. It did not. The silence felt normal, and yet it no longer felt entirely empty. For several nights after that, I made the conscious effort not to leave anything on the dining table. I washed every dish immediately. I wiped the surface dry and I pushed both chairs fully in until they touched the table edge. I didn't treat it like a ritual, but I did it with attention. Nothing happened. The house remained to a quiet pattern that felt almost reassuring. I began to think that whatever had occurred before had been a combination of small physical causes that I had over-examined. When repetition stops, the mind relaxes, I told myself. That night, I woke up again. This time it was not a sound that woke me. It was a smell. It was faint, but clear enough that I recognized it immediately. The smell of freshly steamed rice. Warm and neutral. Not strong, but unmistakable. It did not belong to a room at that hour. I opened my eyes and remained still. I had not cooked rice that evening as I remembered. I ate outside and came home late. The kitchen had been unused all night. I checked my phone screen without sitting up. The time was 2 in the morning. I laid there listening, trying to determine whether the smell could be coming from outside. There was no nearby houses that cooks at that hour, and the windows were all closed. The air inside felt still. Then I heard something that made me sit up slowly. It was not loud. It was the sound of someone exhaling gently, the kind of breath released after swallowing food. It came from the direction of the dining table. The sound did not repeat. It did not escalate. It simply existed, and then the house was quiet again. I swung my legs off the bed and walked towards the main room. My body felt alert, but not panicked. The dining area was dim, lit by only the faint glow from the streetlight outside. The table was empty. There was no bowl, no plate, no food of any kind. The chair opposite mine, however, was no longer aligned with the table. It was pulled out fully, positioned as if someone had been sitting there properly, facing my usual seat. I stepped closer. On the surface of the wooden table, I noticed something I had not seen before. A faint, circular outline marked on the spot where I usually placed my bowl. It was not a stain. It looked more like a slight difference in the layer of dust, as if something had rested there repeatedly. Next to the outline were several thin streaks across the tabletop. There were not scratches in the wood. They looked like lines drawn lightly through dust by fingertips moving towards the edge. I ran my hand over the surface and felt nothing unusual. The wood was smooth, and the marks were only visible at certain angles. I stood there longer than I had intended to. There was no visible presence in the room, no shadow moving across the wall, no sound of footsteps, nothing that would fit the idea of a figure standing in front of me. And yet, the space didn't feel empty. What unsettled me the most was not the idea of something violent or threatening. It was the arrangement. The chair was positioned directly across from mine. The circular outline and the suggestion of a routine forming that did not include me only. The house was behaving as if it had accommodated a second person. I did not shout, I did not run outside, I did not call anyone at that hour. I simply pushed the chair back slowly until it touched the table again and returned to my bedroom. When I lay down, I remained awake for a long time, listening carefully, waiting for another sound. But nothing came. But the smell of rice lingered faintly in the air until morning. The next night after that, I returned to bed from the dining area. I remained awake for quite some time. The house had gone completely still again. There was no further sounds. I lay on my back, listening to the quiet until my thoughts began to blur into a sleep. In the dream, I was standing in the doorway of my bedroom. The house looked exactly the same as it did in real life. The dining table stood near the window, and the faint light from the street lamp outside fell across the wooden surface in the same way it always did at night. Nothing appeared distorted or exaggerated. It felt like I had simply stepped out of bed and walked into the main room. But someone was sitting in the chair across from mine. It was an old man. His back was slightly curved, and he wore a plain white shirt that hung loosely from his shoulders. His hair was thin and gray, and his skin looked pale in the dim light. Not unnatural, just someone who is aged. He didn't look violent or dramatic. He looked like someone who might have once lived in a house like this. The bowl of rice was placed directly in front of him. He did not use his hands, however. Instead, the old man leaned forward slowly, opening his mouth wider than seemed proportionate to his face. His tongue extended outward slowly, longer than it should have been, and it pressed firmly into the center of the rice. The movement was unhurried and deliberate. The surface of the rice lowered under the pressure from the tongue, forming the same rounded depression I had seen in the mornings. He lifted his head slightly, and the grain of rice clung to his tongue before it withdrew back into his mouth. And then he leaned forward again, pressing down once more, compressing the rice evenly without scattering it. The sound was faint, but it was clear in the silence of the room. Slow, wet pressure against the surface of the bowl. At that moment, I realized I couldn't move. My body felt fixed in place in the doorway. I tried to step backward, but my legs did not respond. I tried to speak, but no sound came out. A steady fear rose through me, not sudden or explosive, but heavy and paralyzing. I understood that I was not only watching, I was being allowed to watch. The old man suddenly paused. Very slowly, he lifted his head and turned toward me. His eyes met mine directly. They were opened, but there was something unfocused in them, as if he was looking through me rather than at me. For a moment, his expression remained neutral. Then, suddenly, his mouth curved upward. It was not a wide grin. It was a slow, deliberate smile that stretched further than seemed natural for his face. The corners of his mouth lifted while his eyes remained still, creating an expression that did not match itself. The rice that clung to the edge of his lips and tongue remained there as he held the smile, as if he had forgotten to swallow the rice. He did not speak. He did not blink. He simply continued to stare at me while the smile remained fixed on his face. And then, without breaking eye contact, he leaned forward again and pressed his tongue, his long tongue, into the bowl once more, as if finishing something he had started long before I arrived. The rice sunk further beneath the pressure. I felt the fear fully then, and sharp and immobilizing. My chest tightened and the room felt smaller, though nothing in it had changed. I woke up abruptly. My body was rigid, and my heart was beating faster than usual. The bedroom was dark, and the door was slightly open exactly as I had left it. For several seconds, I couldn't move. The house was silent, but the faint smell of freshly steamed rice lingered in the air, drifting from the direction of the dining table. I did not get up to check. I lay there until morning, fully awake, with the clear understanding that what had been happening to the rice was no accident, and that whatever sat across from me knew I had finally seen it. The following day, I decided to call my grandmother. I didn't describe the chair or the smell or the dream in detail. I simply asked her a simple question instead. I asked why she had always been strict about covering rice at night, even when there was only a small amount left. She paused before answering. Her explanation was calm and direct. She said that in older belief, some spirits did not realize that they had passed on. They continue moving through familiar spaces, repeating simple habits. They may not mean harm. They may only be looking for warmth or food, the same way they once did while alive. She added that if food is left out and acknowledged, even unintentionally, it can create a sense of welcome, not an invitation in a dramatic sense, but a permission to remain. She didn't raise her voice, she didn't try to frighten me. She spoke as if describing something practical, the way she might describe locking the door at night. After that conversation, I finally understood that ignoring the situation was not working at all, but I also knew that reacting with fear would not change anything either. That evening, I made a deliberate decision. I cooked the rice once again. I prepared a simple small bowl, fresh and warm, and placed it at the center of the dining table where I usually sat. I didn't rush. I didn't speak loudly. I lit a single incense stick, the kind that's sold in any convenience store, and set it right up beside the bowl. The house was quiet while I stood there. I spoke softly, not because I believed I was speaking to a visual figure, but because I felt the need to define a boundary clearly. I said that this would be the last time, that I would not leave the food uncovered again, and that I would be moving out soon. I remained standing there for several minutes, watching the surface of the rice without blinking too, as if waiting for a physical response that I could measure. At first, nothing changed. The air didn't move, the chair didn't shift, the house didn't make any unusual sound. And then, gradually, the top of layer of the rice lowered slightly at the center. It was subtle enough that if I had not been looking directly at it, I might have doubted whether it had moved at all. There was no handprint at this time, no visible pressure marks, just a small settling as if a gentle weight had rested there briefly and then lifted again. The rice didn't scatter, the bowl didn't slide, the chair remained in place. The room returned to stillness. I waited until the incense burned out completely. Then I disposed the rice carefully, washed the bowl, and wiped the table again. There was no sense of victory or relief, only the feeling that something had acknowledged the gesture and accepted it without protest. 2 days later, I informed the landlord that I would not be renewing the rental agreement. I gave an ordinary reason, saying that the commute was inconvenient and that I preferred something closer to town. He didn't question it. When I packed my belongings, I left the table clean and empty. I didn't really leave anything behind for anyone else. I moved out at the end of that week. The process itself was uneventful. I packed my clothes into 2 large suitcases, wrapped my kitchenware in old newspaper, and cleaned the house carefully before returning the keys. I wiped the dining table one last time, paying attention to the exact spot where the bowl had always rested. Under the afternoon light, the surface looked ordinary. There was no circular outline anymore, no visible streaks. The wood was smooth and unremarkable. When the landlord came to check the property, he walked through each room with the casual glance of someone who had done this many times before. He did not pause at the dining area. He did not mention anything unusual. From his perspective, the house was simply another rental unit ready for the next renter. I did not tell him about the rice or the chair or the smell at 2 a.m. in the morning. There was no practical reason to bring it up. Nothing had damaged, nothing had been documented, and the house functioned exactly as it should. For a while after moving into a new apartment closer to town, I expected something to follow me. I listened carefully during the first few nights, aware of every single small sound from the refrigerator or the pipes, but nothing really repeated. There was no sense of rice in the middle of the night. No chair moved across the floor, and the new place felt fully empty in a way that an ordinary home does. What stayed with me was not an image, because I never saw anything clearly. It was the pattern. The repetition had formed slowly and logically. A bowl was left uncovered. a surface altered and a chair adjusted, a smell that did not belong to that hour. Each detail alone could be argued away, but together they create a quiet consistency that was difficult to ignore or explain. Even now, years later, I still eat rice almost every day. It is a normal part of living here. When I finish dinner late at night, there is rice left in the bowl. I cover it before I sleep. I do not make a ceremony out of it. I do not light incense. I simply place a lid over it or store it properly. The habit feels practical. I did not know what would have happened if I had stayed in that house and continued leaving food out. I do not know whether the presence would have grown stronger or whether it would have remained as quiet as it was. What I do know is that nothing violent ever occurred there. The house did not collapse, no one was harmed, there was no witness or records. The only evidence was the change in my routine. And as far as I know, the house is still standing in that neighborhood, functioning the way it always has, with a dining table near the window and two chairs facing each other. And that is the end of the story. I hope you guys enjoyed, and I'll see you all in the next story. Thank you.